So, welcome everybody back to the show, and I'm really excited to have on today Fred Pearce. Fred is a environmental journalist of 20 years, I believe, and he's traveled to 67 countries in pursuit of stories. And I think
I get to 87 now.
Oh, 87, sorry.
Yeah.
And he's written, I think, going on 10 books. Am I right? Yeah.
Sure.
So, and he's here today to talk about his new book that's coming out. Let me make sure I got that on screen. Which is A Trillion Trees: Restoring Our Forests by Trusting in Nature. So, welcome. First of all, thanks for speaking with me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Eric. It's good to be with you.
Yeah. So the one thing I like to ask book authors when they come on is just, could you maybe tell us just a little bit about the process of this book, the origin of this book, and why trees in particular?
Well, it's been kind of gestating for a long time, 20 or 30 years probably. As an environment reporter, forests and trees are just they're one of the constants. I mean, even before we were talking about climate change, we were talking about deforestation in the Amazon and elsewhere. It's just one of those stories. So I've been following it all for a long time and visiting forests as much as I can in my travels around the world. But it seemed to me that kind of now was the moment. Everybody's now talking about a trillion trees. That's the title of the book. If you go to Davos World Economic Forum, or even Donald Trump was talking about a trillion trees a little while ago, I seem to remember. It's one thing that everybody kind of agrees about. Yeah, we need a trillion more trees. For perspective, we have about 3 trillion trees now. We maybe had 6 trillion at one time, so we've shaved half of them off the planet. And a lot of people are saying we probably have room for 1 trillion trees, and if we put those back, it would be at least a big contribution to fixing climate change.
Yeah.
It wouldn't solve it. We still got to reduce those emissions, in my judgment. But it would give us a bit more time, if you like, to get the actual emissions down and stop. We can put some carbon into the forests while we stop taking all that carbon out from underground and throwing it into the atmosphere.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of talk about 1 trillion trees. So I thought, okay, well, let's take some perspective on this. I'm not so much a kind of doom monger about environmental issues. I see deforestation; it's still happening, but I also see reforestation happening. And the UN's been talking about a decade of ecological restoration, and a lot of that's going to be about trees. We've had various declarations, most recently at the Glasgow Climate Conference, but you go back to New York 7 years ago, and there was a similar declaration. We were going to end deforestation and start restoration of forests. So it's a really live issue. So I'm a journalist, so I went for it.
So when we're talking about forests, I mean that directly references trees, right? I mean there's no forests that don't have trees, right?
Yeah, though there are trees that are not in forests. I have a couple of chapters about how many trees there are on farms. They can be just kind of field boundaries, or they're just kind of small areas of trees for producing firewood, or whatever. So there are a lot of trees around that aren't in what you or I would call forests, and
Right.
For me they're good too.
Yeah. And is there, in terms of our ecosystems, is there something special about trees versus other types of vegetation? I think that's something that people probably don't think much about because trees are so ubiquitous to our landscape, but is there something unique about them? Yeah.
They are our dominant our dominant form of vegetation on the planet, certainly in terms of biomass or in terms of the amount of carbon they contain. The only other comparable ecosystem is some of our wetlands, the peat bogs and so on. It's all underground, but they contain an awful lot of carbon. But trees, and culturally, we go back, trees are pretty central to how humans have thought of themselves ever since we came down from the trees a few million years ago. Trees are, we're about trees. All our folk stories and so on, a lot of those are about trees and forests. And I have a whole chapter talking about how we're scared by trees, but also entranced by them. I'm always fascinated by language. So we used to talk a lot about jungles, which are scary places with lots of weird animals that would go and eat us. But now we talk about rainforests, and rainforests kind of cuddly and nice and are good for the ecosystem. So, we have this kind of ambivalent relationship, I think, with forests and with trees. And that all, that's all part of it. It's part of the language of how we talk about them. And again, why they're so central to us. But certainly ecologically, probably half the world's species, certainly half of the terrestrial species on the planet are in and around forests. They hold more carbon than probably anything else. So they're absolutely central to the way our planet works, the way that ecosystems work. They're where most of our biodiversity is. So they're absolutely central. And that's why, losing them is bad news.
Yeah, I was going to say, and you mentioned sort of environmentalism. I think of maybe trees as being an icon, a terrestrial icon of the environmental movement, whereas like whales are the marine version of that. Nobody's getting worked up about peat bogs. But cutting down trees is people get really emotional about that.
I could talk to you about the carbon cycle of whales, which is that's another story. But it's great fun. I mean, there's always a danger of seeing everything through the prism of carbon. I know climate change is important, but I think we should think about trees as other things. I mean, one of the large part of the book is about how trees influence climate in ways unconnected with carbon. Yes, they soak up carbon and hence will kind of minimize global warming by keeping the CO2 out of the atmosphere. But they also have huge local effect and regional effects. They generate rain. If you go inland on continents where there aren't trees along the coast, it gets drier as you go inland. If you go inland in continents that have trees, it gets wetter as you go inland, and the reason for that is that trees are recycling the rain. The moisture comes in off the ocean, it rains out. If there are trees there, they transpire it back into the atmosphere, and it goes on the winds and goes downstream, and it rains further downwind. So they're absolutely central. They keep us cool locally as well, not just the shade, but the interchange. The transpiring of the moisture also keeps the air cool. And some scientists I talk to reckon that they generate a lot of the winds as well. So they're really central to not just the climate in that sort of big sense of greenhouse gases and so on, but I mean where rainfall happens and local rain, the local meteorology, if you like, is really tied up with trees as well.
Yeah, that was, it was a really, as I read this book, I just was like, the whole time going, wow, that's so I didn't know that. I didn't know that about trees. I didn't know that about what position the role that they play in climate and things like that. It's so fascinating. I mean, that if
you take them down, you change the local climate as well. You can see that a chapter where I go to the edge of where the Amazon is being attacked by farmers, and you can see right on the edge there, and I spoke to scientists who are doing this, you can measure how the climate changes as those trees come down, and how you're changing the climate so much that if you like, once you could destroy a rainforest, it may not come back as rainforest. I mean, I'm a great believer in the fact that trees will regrow. And that it's not a one-way trip when you lose trees. Nature will restore trees, but it won't always restore the same trees, because you'll have changed the climate when you take out that rainforest, and what may come back may be more like a savanna forest than a rainforest, because there's simply less rain.
Yeah, you referred to these that cycle as a flying river, I believe, in the book.
Yeah, that's right. This is a phrase which they more or less developed in Brazil, where they could see it happening real time over the Amazon. So much moisture is being recycled back into the atmosphere by the forests there that you create what are more or less literally flying rivers. You can fly in a plane through them and measure the moisture there, and that's carrying on downwind and creating a new cycle of rainfall, so that you can go to, Argentina or Uruguay, these kind of countries which are not forested, or certainly not rainforested, But most of their land is used for agriculture, for growing crops, for growing soy or cattle ranching and so on. And most of the rain that they're getting is actually moisture that's been recycled by the Amazon. So you take out the Amazon, you don't just mess with the rainforest. You mess with all the crop growing regions around. Yeah. So you can chop down the rainforest because you want to grow more crops, but you may find that those crops won't grow because you won't have the rain. These are the kind of forces that we're dealing with when we mess with forests on the kind of scale that we're now doing. And we've seen that. Climate's changed in Europe and North America too, as forests have come out, and it is something which we can, we need to start thinking about putting these things back, restoring the world's forests, and hence the title of the book. But
so let me ask.
You can go too far, and it's going to be really hard. But in fact, the longer you wait, the harder it's going to be.
Right. So let me ask you a bit of a devil's advocate question. But let's say you had a really arid region like the Sahara Desert. You wanted to get more rainfall there, would you increase the number of forests and trees along the coast of Africa to get more rain there? I mean, would that work? Or
it should work. Yeah. That's certainly the way to try it. You're playing with forces that are difficult. The relationship between the forests on the land and the ocean circulation and that kind of thing may mess things up. But in principle, and in most places, if you start putting trees back, you will generate rain. And the place to start putting the trees back is certainly on the coast, because that's where the trees will grow, because there's rain coming in off the land. And if you can work in land and start from the coast and work in land and putting trees in place, eventually nature will figure it out and will start growing the trees itself. But it's probably a good idea to give it a helping hand at the start. One of the themes in my book is that nature will do most of the work. If we're going to have 1 trillion trees, we're not going to plant 1 trillion trees. I mean, it's difficult to get your head around how big a number 1 trillion is, but it's, you would have to be planting thousands of trees more or less every second for the next 30 years to get up to 1 trillion trees. Honestly, nature is going to do it better than we can. So, but we can give nature a kickstart. We can help things along, and I think that's going to be the trick in the next few decades. Figuring out how the ecological restoration that we've got to do on the planet, and I think we will do, because I'm an optimist about how we can create space for nature again. We use land very wastefully now. We can do a lot better. And we need to do a lot better to help nature control the big cycles on the planet and maintain the climate and so on. So that's going to be the trick, is finding out how we can just kind of tip nature over the edge so that she starts rebuilding.
Right. I mean, I think one message that I took away from the book was that, planting more trees, I should say, doesn't equal, better. Like, it's not that simple, right? I felt like this is a more nuanced take on it. There's upsides, downsides, and, a lot of that is dependent upon like where you're planting them, and then you've got this whole thing about carbon credits and people planting trees, and this idea that, you just, pop that tree in somewhere and now I can do what I want in terms of generating, carbon emissions. I think the thing is we've got to plant the trees and reduce the emissions. As soon as you've got to trade off between the other, it will just reduce the imperative to cut the emissions. And trees can take up carbon, but they can only do it once. But if you're burning fossil fuels year on year on year to generate energy, that is putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And there's only so much that trees can take up with the best will in the world. So we've got to do both. The problem with those financial systems that like to trade off and buy carbon credits, they are in danger, unless they're really carefully organized, they're in danger of actually postponing the moment where we really grasp the nettle. I mean, I'm a relative optimist. I think that technology is moving on sufficiently that it doesn't make so much sense to burn fossil fuels in a lot of circumstances now. Right. So we're getting wise to that. So I do think we can do it, and that it's not an environmental killer. But we got to plant the trees as well, partly because it'll give us time, and partly because it'll produce a better
functioning ecosystem for future decades. I think we just kind of need to do it. The other thing, yeah, I think as to where you plant the trees, there's a surprising amount of room, not necessarily for planting, but for allowing trees to regrow. If you look across North America, there's a lot of abandoned farmland, and forest is naturally coming back, and we can encourage that process. As a planet as a whole, we actually have more trees than we had 30 years ago. They're not all in natural forests, as you would say, but we have more trees, and forest restoration is happening. And we need to encourage that. But, it's going to happen where forests used to live or where forests can grow now. We don't want to start planting up deserts on a large scale. Ecologically, you might be able to do some kind of geoengineering effects with the climate. But, I'm a great believer in, I sometimes say save the deserts as well as save the forest, because deserts are ecosystems on their own grounds, and arid areas of the planet are really kind of important. So we shouldn't see them as just sort of an empty canvas where we're going to put up trees. The other thing to say is that in an environment like that, trees can actually warm the planet. We know,
that's fascinating.
There's a decent amount of science which says that if you start planting trees in Arctic regions, you change the reflectivity of the surface of the land so much that you land up heating. If you think of it this way, if you're replacing a dark forest canopy, putting that in where there was snow, well, the snow was reflecting virtually all the sunlight right back into space. It was acting as like a freezer for Arctic regions. Whereas if you put in trees, that's a dark surface that absorbs solar radiation and emits heat, and you have so that despite the carbon effect, which is more than counterbalancing the carbon effect, you can actually have an overall heating effect if you put trees in Arctic regions. And the same rather applies to deserts. A lot of deserts are very light, sandy, reflective. You get you can blind yourself in the desert because it's just so reflective. So if you start planting trees there, again, you're having the same effect. You're replacing a very reflective surface with a very dark canopy surface. And there's been research done in Israel where they've done a bit of planting of trees in desert regions on the edge of the Negev desert and so on. And I visit one of these areas in the book. Their overall effect is actually going to be to warm the planet rather than cool the planet. So you've got to be a little bit careful what you're doing sometimes. Trees are great, and we want trees in lots and lots of places, but planting them in deserts is probably not a smart move.
I just find that I found that so interesting too. I mean, you just intuitively, when you walk into a forest out of the hot sun, it feels cooler to you, right? So I find that kind of surprising in a way that what's called I think albedo or albedo effect. That's
right. The reflectivity.
Is actually decreased, right, when there's
forest. If you're out of the sun, it'll cool you down. You'll be okay. But if you look at the wider environment, it's actually heating the atmosphere around. There are complex interactions here, and it's different at day or different at night, or the seasonal differences and so on. So there's a lot of stuff going on, and the flow of moisture interrupts these things or changes these things. So, the scientists have to be a little bit careful to balance everything. I love that complexity. I mean, some people are a bit scared by it. I rather love it. And we're still learning stuff, but there are parts of the world, including quite large parts of the United States, I might say, where not just Alaska, but even further south, where planting trees is not necessary. I mean, there are complications here because, of course, the carbon that you accumulate keeps, as while the tree is still growing, it's still taking more carbon dioxide in, so it's having a more and more of a cooling effect down the years. Whereas the reflectivity is like a one-off thing. It's just that it's the warming effect is the same today as it will be in 10 years' time or 20 years' time.
Right.
So there are like time thresholds as well. You might find that there's a warming effect for the first few years, but if your trees survive and grow, then maybe after 50 years they'll contain sufficient carbon that they'll flip into being an overall kind of cooling effect. Part of the problem in Israel is that the climate's changing there so fast they don't think the trees are going to survive that long. the trees that they've been planting in the last 40 or 50 years, they think they're going to be dead before they flip into the cooling phase. So, all this kind of stuff's got to be looked at.
Yeah.
It's not simply a matter of planting trees good, much as I like trees.
Yeah,
So,
I think you
enjoying the complexity, but I do rather.
I think you captured this complexity and nuance really well. One thing also that I feel like a little bit this book is kind of poo-pooing the idea that planting trees is always the best solution as well. I mean, it's even in the subtitle, Restoring Our Forest by Trusting in Nature.
Yeah.
There's this idea that if we just sort of let nature take its course, that it will reforest itself. So my question about that is, so I'm from Washington State originally, so I grew up surrounded by pine trees, but often there's clear cuts up in the hills, and you can see where the paper companies or whatever have gone in and reseeded, and there's because all the trees are like bright green and they're coming up in the same spot. But is there value in doing that, or would it be better just to let the land recover on its own, to let the forest recover on its own?
Well, it depends what you're trying to do. I think. I mean, yeah. If you're basically a tree farm, then you probably do want to plant, because you can plant the trees are going to grow fastest. You'll have a predictable output, that you can come in 10 or 20 years or whatever the life cycle is, and do the harvest and plant some more, and and unless the bark beetle gets it, which of course if you have monocultures, then you can have real disease problems, and they're having them. So that's part of the story. But if you know your silviculture and you don't screw up, then for a forester that may look good. But if you have other interests, if you're interested in the biodiversity, if you're interested in the effect on climate, if you're interested in how good the soils are, if you're interested in those kind of other things, or indeed if you're somebody used the forests for other purposes, you might be an indigenous community that has a whole range of uses for the forests, for fruit and for hunting, and for maintaining the flows of the rivers and all sorts of stuff, then you may have other priorities. And if you want anything approaching a natural forest, a biologically diverse forest, a forest with good soils, a forest that maintains the hydrology of the local river system, that kind of thing, if you want to sort of recreate that, nature is probably rather better at doing it than you. People talk a lot, certainly in Europe, about rewilding. That's the big thing. Everybody wants to do rewilding, but people have different ways that they think about it. Some people just want to plant everything up in detail, sort of, which is more like gardening than rewilding, it seems to me. And some people want to just kind of let nature rip. And I'm with the let nature rip people. I think nature will probably recreate a forest better than we can with all our kind of scientific knowledge of how ecosystems work. So I'm in favour of letting it rip, but of course it depends on what you want. If you want a high productive forest, and there will be cases for high production forests, because it may allow you to leave natural forests alone that you would otherwise have started chopping down. So I'm not saying that monoculture is necessarily bad, but it's one way of having a productive forest. And if we're going to do it, let's do it well, and let's make the most out of those so we can spare other regions.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But no, I'm firmly of the view that if you want to restore something like a natural forest, no, I mean, they're not really natural, I mean, they're all kind of, we messed with forests for so long, for thousands of years, that none of them are natural in any real sense. And now we're changing the climate, which is altering things again. So, but if you want a kind of diverse forest, if you want a sort of natural feeling forest with a lot of different species in, lots of insects and, all that kind of stuff, then nature is going to be better at it.
That was an interesting, another interesting point that you made about actually a chapter or two about indigenous populations, and how when people came from Europe to colonize the Americas, for example, they found they thought that this was just a kind of virgin wilderness, but in fact, the indigenous people had been manipulating the land for many, many years in South America and North America. I found that very interesting too, because we think of the Amazon in particular, which I believe is the largest forest in the world, as this kind of untouched wilderness that we're destroying. But in fact, it's been manipulated for many, many, many years.
Yeah, I mean, there's no virgin forest out there, really. There were big cities, certainly by the standards of the time in the Amazon, only a few hundred years ago. Europeans showed up and we massacred some people and we brought in diseases that killed an awful lot more. And the survivors kind of retreated into the forest and the forest regrew. But the very first people that went along the Amazon River and just sort of reported what they saw, reported seeing really quite large urban areas stretching back into what is now forest. And those disappeared very quickly because the people simply disappeared. And if you're in the Amazon, the forest will come back really very quickly. Within a couple of decades, or certainly 3 or 4 decades, you'll have regrowth, which is, to a layman's eye, and indistinguishable from what was there before. So large areas of the Amazon, probably most of the Amazon, is in some sense a kind of overgrown garden. And we discover lots. The archaeologists are discovering these sort of remains of ancient cities. We know that people rework the landscape in lots of ways to do agriculture. We know there are large numbers of the trees in the Amazon were actually planted or encouraged to grow by local people. You can see the kind of groves of different productive trees, which are found along sort of old roadways and that kind of thing. The more you look, the more you discover on the forest floor to see that this is far from virgin. And much the same is true in North America. So Europeans in our romantic way, we tend to think that we stumbled on this sort of virgin world in the New World, but it wasn't really like that. It was a much busier place than we imagine, and a much more engineered place in a sense. What you can say, I think, is that the locals were a lot better at managing that than the Europeans who came in and brought their European ways of, you see this most strongly in attitudes to fire. For Europeans, think that fire is bad in forests. And so, we've been trying to suppress fire for a long, long time. And the result is you have such a buildup of forest, of sort of dry material on the forest floor, that when you do get a fire, it's a much bigger fire. And we're seeing some of the consequences of that now in the recent big wildfires. That's partly to do with climate change, but it's also to do with the way that we manage the forests. And so now there's a move back to what in our scientific way we call control burns. Yeah. So you go in, before at the start of the dry season, but before everything's really dry, and do small controlled burns that you can control, because that will reduce the amount of dry stuff on the floor, so that if there is a big flare up later on, it won't take off in the way that we've seen some do. So that's the traditional way of managing forests. You talk to indigenous communities, some of them have always done it. Some of them have kind of half forgotten, or it's a folk memory, but they take to it. And of course, the sort of more broad-minded forest managers are now going to indigenous communities and saying, well, how did you guys manage this? You seem to do it better than we did, and what can we learn? So there's quite a lot of re-education going on, quite a lot of relearning of, if you like, the old ways, to put it in a slightly romantic sense, of how forests were managed. And it turns out that these lessons are really, really important as the climate changes, and forests are more threatened by being, if you like, in an extreme environment for their survival. And if they're going to survive, if they're going to evolve to live in a rather warmer world, they're going to need all the tricks that we can come up with. And a lot of those, it turns out, are better known not just by indigenous communities, but often just by regular rural communities. So some rural communities learn this stuff too. So I'm a great believer. I'm a great believer listening to the people in the forests, and actually I'm a great believer in giving the forests back, if you can use that language, to the people who know them best. And that's often maybe just smallholder farmers. I'm not saying that they should be frozen out, but certainly a lot of that knowledge is still with Indigenous communities. It's amazing how it survived, but it is still there.
Yeah, it seems like Indigenous peoples, from what you've talked about in the book, are better at sort of living, not to use a cliched term, but living in harmony with forests. It's not that they're not changing them or manipulating them or engineering them, as you said, in some way. They're just
better at it.
They're just better.
They're better at using them. They're better at managing them. They understand that if you keep these trees in place, you'll get more wildlife that you can then hunt, or if you keep this fruit, then animals will. All the kind of sophistication of ecosystems which ecologists spend years and trying to learn is almost kind of folk knowledge in I don't want to romanticize it too much. I mean, clearly it's not always like that, but there is a lot of knowledge out there. And the sensible thing to do is to try and learn it and make use of it.
I think you mentioned a bush people in Africa that were able to, they're managing something like 250 native plants in their environment or something like that to produce more food or food around them.
I think that's pretty normal, really. I mean, people who've lived in the forest and used the forest, they're pretty poor, but they know what's in the forest that they can harvest, and they know how to make sure that they get a harvest next year as well. And maybe they still do hunting, and they know that the interactions between animals and trees. So there's a lot of that, and they're now relearning. Farmers in West Africa I've seen where they've been told by colonial agricultural extension people, the experts come in and tell them, no, you've got to take all the trees away so that you can plow your land more easily. And if you before you plant your crops you discover roots in the ground, then rip them up and clear everything out so that you can have a sort of clear run for your crops. And this went on right up into sort of drought times in the 1970s and 1980s when large areas on the edge of the Sahara were just going to desert, and it was a desperate situation, and there were famines and so on. And people suddenly started learning there, almost by trial and error, that actually if you left the trees there, if you didn't haul up all the roots, if you didn't remove all the sort of undergrowth before you planted your crops, you got a few trees there, and it was a bit harder to harvest, but the trees provided shade, and they provided bark that you could use for stuff, and they provided fruit, and they improved the soils, and they provided stuff that you could sell in the local markets, and they generally became a good thing, and they were getting more rather than less yield from their crops of maize or millet or whatever they were planting, and they were getting all these other kind of side benefits. And they were providing shade so that villages were better to live in, a whole bunch of stuff. So what we now find, and it took scientists, geographers rather, quite a long time to realize that because nobody was really looking, but they suddenly discovered that in the southern half of Niger, one of these West African countries on the edge of the Sahara Desert, there were suddenly a lot more trees, and geographers had been away for a few years, and I interviewed them, and they were absolutely fascinated. They said, well, we went there in the 1970s and the 1980s, and there were no trees, and we went away, and then we came back 10 years, and the whole area was covered in trees, and nobody told us. And it turns out there's a massive reforestation going on. I say forest, I mean these are trees on farmland, perhaps 10 trees on an acre or something of that sort. But there are trees that are part of the landscape, useful part of the landscape, that are improving the landscape for local people, and of course having knock-on effects on local climate and local river flows, and they're absorbing some carbon too. So people kind of realize then, I think, that, well, actually, isn't this the way we always used to do these things before these, in this case, French agriculturalists came in and told us how to do it properly? And they're kind of going, well, why don't we just go back to what we used to do? hey, it works better, you know.
It
And
just seemed,
I love that.
yeah.
You know, it's kind of a mixture of folk knowledge, but also just of experimenting and learning and being innovative
Yeah.
and you know, doing all the things that we Westerners sometimes think that we're so clever at. But it turns out, you know, local knowledge can be really good too.
Yeah, it just seems like there's this hubris of science and sort
Yeah,
of European colonialism, where we're gonna teach the folk people how to do it, and they throw out all the folk knowledge that's been accumulated over thousands of
yeah,
years. And I see this also in things like folk medicine, where it's like, okay, and that's tied into forests too, because a lot of those remedies come
you
from the
bet.
forest. And
I
instead
mean,
of saying,
my thinking about some of this is, I mean, I think Western, you know, I'm a science journalist. I'm a fan of Western science. I know what
oh
Western
yeah,
science.
yeah,
Western science is that sort of tradition of science, the Enlightenment tradition of science, if you like, is brilliant at drawing, you know, sort of drawing the big rules. You know, we'll see the big picture and we'll be able to compare one place with another and say, well, that wasn't. So here's a general rule, a general proposition. Western science is brilliant at doing that, and that's really, really useful. But often the local specific knowledge is more useful in a local. So you then find that the Western agriculturalists or ecologists or whoever they are have learned the big principles, and they kind of have a big picture of how the world works and so on. And then they come in and they try and apply it locally, and they suddenly find, or hopefully they discover that well, you know, the local environment is more complex. There are local particular circumstances. There are, there's stuff going on there that's not really relevant at the big scale that they know about, but is really critical at the small scale. And the people who know about the small scale are going to be the locals.
mm-hmm.
But it's, as you say, hubris is the thing. It's quite hard for the people who know the big picture, know it really well and better than anybody else, to realize that may actually not be so important at the local scale, and maybe that local knowledge is more important. And it's a lesson that people are learning. I mean, I
Yeah,
interview ecologists these days who say, well, yeah, we know all this stuff. We've done all the PhD theses, and we teach lots of people, and they come to our campuses, and we tell them all sorts of stuff, and it's really useful and it's valuable, and da, 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 da. But actually, when you go and talk to the local people, you discover that they know far more about their ecosystem, their own local ecosystem, than we can ever do. They've got many more names for different things. They know the interactions at the local level. So that's the thing. You know, if we can better mold together the big scale picture while recognizing the sort of the very locally specific, then we'll manage the planet a lot better, I think.
do you think that it's a problem of communication, in the sense that the people, the indigenous people or the local people, don't know how to talk about these things in a way that makes sense to scientists?
Well, that's true. It's also the scientists don't know how to talk.
Well, yes, yes, of course. But I'm thinking about.
It's clearly there are communications, but it's more than that. I mean, there are. I'm sure the local people don't always recognize the value of the big picture stuff that people can provide from outside, but equally the outside people who tend to think that they're the top dogs. And many local people will look up to them and say, well, you're the big guys, you've got the letters after your name, you must know what's going on. So the boot is certainly generally on the foot of the generalists and the global experts. And understandably, because they can travel around the world, and what they say is of relevance to a lot of places, whereas what the locals know may be only relevant to their river valley. It may have no value almost literally anywhere outside, except as a sort of cultural discussion point. So we need to recognize the strengths and the weaknesses of both sides. It's partly about communication, but it's more than that. It's about perceptions of what is valuable and what isn't, and what is about academic reputations in careers and all sorts of other stuff as well. Let's be clear. A lot of this is quite personal.
Yeah, that's a facet of.
I speak as a journalist. So, I mean, I suppose I kind of think more on the side of the generalists trying to
sure
make sense of the world from a rather sort of vaguely Olympian standpoint. But I hope I don't suffer from too much of the hubris. If I go into a local area, right, first thing, I don't want to start telling people what to do. I want to start asking questions.
Well, and again, that comes through in the book. I think you talk to so many. I can't imagine how many people to write this, and Indigenous people and scientists, and it's amazing.
I've been traveling a lot, but that's it's partly because I enjoy it, but it is the way you learn. I'm a slightly old-fashioned journalist. A lot of journalists sort of sit at computers these days and reckon they can understand the world, and I'm old school enough not to think that's true.
Yeah, I'm jealous. I wish I could have traveled. Well, I've got time, but 87 countries is kind of amazing. It's getting harder to persuade
editors to pay for trips, I tell you.
Oh yes, yeah. No, I know that's true. But yeah, that's as far as providing on the ground details about things. I mean, it really makes the story come alive, and
it's also the stuff that you learn that you didn't know. You don't know what you don't know. I'm a fan of Donald Rumsfeld in his phrase that the unknown unknowns as a proposition, and I'm all in favour of unknown unknowns. That's what I'm interested in.
Can I just quote you? I'm a fan of Donald Rumsfeld. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
He had some clever lines for sure.
It was more than a clever line. I thought it was quite a profound line. He didn't apply it in some of his policy making, but that's another story.
That's for another show.
I think there were kind of three big things I was trying to say in the book. One of which is that trees are not just about carbon; they're about climate and the local weather in much more profound ways than we've got used to thinking about. It's one of my. I'm absolutely agreed that we've got to fix climate change, but we these days seem to run everything through the prism of climate change, and we can lose a lot when we're doing that. So we have to be careful about that. Then the second thing was about natural regeneration, because I think that's going to work better under most circumstances. Nature knows how to do it best. There's plenty of evidence for that. And the third strand was local control. I've written books about land rights. Wrote a book called The Land Grabbers about how local land was being taken by sort of the corporate world, if you like. That's not just about kind of environmental and land rights justice, though I think that's important, but I think it's also about better functioning ecosystem. The simple truth in many parts of the world, most parts of the world probably, is that local indigenous management of the land, even if they're using it quite intensely, and certainly is true of forests, is a better conservation tool than putting land behind national parks. In many parts of the world, and there are some examples in the book of how forests protected inside nature reserves and national parks are the ones that get, really because there's no ownership of them apart from state ownership, which is a pretty half-hearted ownership, gets ransacked and people move in and they do all sorts of crazy things and have no interest in the long term of the land because it's not theirs. Whereas the land that is used, it's a use it or use it or lose it philosophy. The land that is used by people who have an interest in it and a cultural relationship with it and an expectation that their future generations will use it as well. Those are the people who will manage the land better. And that's where you see the forests. You can go, whether you're in the Amazon or North America or Southeast Asia or Africa or wherever you are. It's the people who have control of their forests, who are sometimes regarded as environmental pariahs because, they're destroying everything, they're coming in, they're tearing down the forest, they're doing this. Excuse me. The truth is rather different. The truth is usually, not always, but usually that they're managing the land a lot better. And the more control that they have over the land, the more sense of a stake in the future they will have over it.
So I have a question about that, though. As technology, more and more people have access to technology and we become more efficient at harvesting resources and things like that, do you think that will continue to be true for Indigenous peoples, that they won't sort of overuse the land in the same way that people in first world countries have?
Well, there's no guarantee, but my experience, that of researchers who've trying to put numbers on all this, is that they do. It depends on a number of things. It depends on communities that are still able to exert control over their resources, control over their land. If outsiders are coming in and they can't keep them out, then that's a problem. And clearly things can go downhill, so that everybody is just taking what they can from the land while they can, at the sort of tragedy of the commons problem.
Yeah.
More typically, it is about power, it's about politics, it's about control. If communities do have control over their land, they're really quite good, even now, even today, at making good decisions about that. Politics is never perfect, and this is local politics rather than national politics, and we know either can go wrong. But a lot of it's about control. And if you lose it, then, if this was your forest and somebody's come in and the government's told you that you can't do this and you can't do that in your forest, and the park rangers are in charge, you're going to say, well, I'll go, okay, all right, well, I'll come in and chop down trees in the middle of the night, or go hunting the animals, go poaching. But it's poaching when it's, you're not supposed to be doing it. It's hunting when you are. But you're going to come in and you're going to do stuff, and you're not going to care much for the future because, you're not in control of the future.
Yeah.
If you feel you are in control of the future, things can be better. As I say, nothing's perfect, and I'm not saying that governments should completely keep out. A lot of the best management of ecosystems happenings when there are deals between governments and local communities, ones that kind of stand up so that there's external scrutiny, but a sense of control locally. So I'm not saying that everything will be perfect if we just hand things back. My experience is that the bad stuff happens when control is taken away from local people, and the best examples of successful management are when communities are in control. People talk a lot about community conservation now, and they talk about it a lot because it works.
Yeah, I think intuitively that does make sense, because if you're invested in something,
right. If we're in control of something, we'll take a view about it, and we'll care about it.
Yeah.
And if we're not, and if somebody's sort of messing things up for us, then we get, well, to hell with them,
Yeah. So I had one final thing I wanted to ask you about. So, and I like to ask this when we're talking about these big kind of environmental issues, are there things that individuals can do to help improve forests? Is it, if it's not planting trees, what is it? I mean, what should they be doing? Should they be planting trees? Maybe,
I'm not against planting trees. All I say, it's good, and people like to do it, and it makes their local environments better. So I'm all in favor. I'm all in favor of planting trees and campaigning to have more trees in your local environment. Is good. Urban areas are much better with more trees.
Yeah.
Excuse me. I do think a lot of the stuff happens at a political level, but as a consumer, you should certainly be looking at that you're not buying wood products or paper products that are taken in ways that you disapprove of, whether from land grabbing or non-sustainable forestry. There are plenty of consumer labels out there that provide some. They're not perfect, but they provide some protection in those kind of ways. So look out for those things. So as a consumer, do that. As a consumer, think that you're buying from companies that you think at a certain level are trying to do things better. And I think corporations notice that. So a lot of the reason why some corporations are really pretty good at their forest management and their procurement policies for timber products and other products from forests is because they know about consumer pressure, and they know that if they're bad guys, Greenpeace will be after them, and if Greenpeace is after them, then the general public gets wise to that and will buy from somebody else. So that matters, and I think that also plays up to the political level, because I think if corporations or some corporations see advantage in taking the environmental high road, then they will want governments to impose regulations so that everybody has to do it, because they don't want free riders coming in and just sort of messing things up for them. If they decide on a high road path, then the big some of the big corporations, and some of the big corporations are among the best in this area these days, because they have more investment to lose, so they're more careful. But they then want to secure their investments better by having tough regulation. So you can get into a virtuous cycle.
Right.
And again, I don't want to be, I'm not going to say that solves all our problems, but there are real levers that we can pull as consumers, as voters for sure. Let's not vote for the bad guys. And then in an individual, personal level, in local politics, join community groups that are trying to do things with the environment, whether it's trees or what. We can all do this kind of stuff. Rewild your back garden.
Yeah.
In England, I'm sitting here in London, where everybody has their little back garden, and they're all planting, and they're mowing their lawns every Saturday and all that. Rewild your lawn. Don't mow it. Just leave it and see what grows. You'll probably find that some birds will come in and they'll drop some seeds. I'll have an oak tree in your back. I've got one growing in my back garden right now, where I think a jay came in and left an acorn behind. So
I like that though. Start with your backyard. I like that. That's great advice.
Yeah, and if it's not against the bylaws, get some trees in. But you don't have to plant them. Probably nature will do it for you if you give her a bit of room.
All right, awesome. So why don't we leave it there, and I'll just show the book again. So it's when is this coming out? By the way,
It's coming out back end of. They tell me back end of April.
Back end of April.
Probably because they're usually rather bad at telling you when the book comes, but you'd better check.
So
it's about April, back end of April, beginning of May. So we've got a while, yeah.
Cool. So we're a bit ahead of the curve on that. So and then where can people find you if they want to follow your work? Because you also, in addition to writing books, write articles, and how best to follow your work?
These days, my most regular presence is on a website that operates out of Yale University Environment Department called Yale Environment 360.
Oh yeah, great publication.
I write a piece there about every month, so a lot of my journalism appears there. Elsewhere too, I'm a freelance. I'll go wherever anybody will pay me, but the stuff that I like to do tends to turn up there.
Okay, awesome. Well, thanks so much, Fred. Very enlightening, and really enjoyed reading your book. So thanks again.
It was fun to talk to you. Cheers.
All right, cheers.